Well, hello there. That works. Hi, everyone. It's Mike here. Capricious Black Box. This is going to be, I think, episode 3 of Hot Tub Deliberations. It's actually going to be probably the first legitimate episode because I'm actually currently in the hot tub. And I thought I would just record some audio and see how it works and use it for notes. If you're not seeing my face, it's because I just decided to go ahead and upload the audio as is. So it's not quite a full moon tonight. It's a couple of days away by the looks of things, but it's very bright out. And I was sitting in the hot tub and I thought, I might as well just go ahead and record the thoughts that were already going through my mind anyway. And so that's what this is going to be. This past week I watched a couple of videos, and they got me thinking about intolerance. Specifically, I'd watched a video in which Campbell was on with J.D. Kane. And it might have been a Raw 5069 hangout. I'm not sure. Here's a little bit of proof that I'm in the hot tub. It might have been Raw's hangout. Raw was in there anyway. And another video that I watched was one where Campbell was talking about the quote-unquote cyberbullying of Jason Burns. And then the third video that I'm referencing is another video that Campbell put up where he was talking about intolerance. And these things got me thinking quite a bit. Now, on the video where Campbell was on with J.D. Kane, I'll link all these below and you can have a look if you feel so inclined. They were talking about popular, I think of late anyway, YouTube personality that goes by the name of Nadia. And Nadia is on, I've seen Nadia on quite a few different hangouts. She's, seems to be pretty intelligent and well-spoken and fairly deep, I would say. And they were talking about transgender and homosexual and homophobia and these kind of issues. And Campbell was being quite bigoted and quite obtuse. He was also being very obtuse in his argumentation. He was trying to make several points with JD, and he just sort of wanted to steamroller over the parts where JD said, I reject the premise. I don't agree with the premise. And of course, he just wanted to talk louder and sort of force J.D. Kane to accept whatever premise he was bringing forth. Actually, the premise in that case was about worship. And he was saying everybody worships. This was the case that Campbell was making. And of course, J.D. Kane disagreed with us. And Campbell said, well, have you ever applauded at a rock concert? Or have you ever, cheered at a float going by in a parade? That these are forms of worship. Have you ever done these things? And of course, J.D. rightfully said, well, I reject the premise that those things are worship. This simple expression of appreciation for something. First of all, is not the recognized definition of worship, but if you're going to, make a case like that and someone doesn't accept your premise, well then, the onus is on you then to make an argument for it. What Rand wanted to do was just talk louder. He ended up, of course, getting frustrated because J.D. wasn't accepting his premise and started making insinuations that he was gay and that he was... there was some pretty crude references. I'm not going to go over those here. But the bottom line is that, he was displaying his intolerance, both by the things that he said about Nadia specifically and the way he was insinuating that J.D. Kane was homosexual as though that is a bad thing or something to be mocked and ridiculed, etc., to be intolerant of. Of course, the next video he talked a lot about the quote-unquote cyberbullying of Jason Burns. He really just demonstrated a clear lack of understanding about what's actually taken place on YouTube with Jason Burns. And we all know that Jason is not innocent in what's taken place with him and that no one actually means him any harm. There's no actual intentional bullying of Jason taking place, at least not from the people who are normally in the circle, the Captain Asimos, the Alex Bottons, and the other Ozzy of all people, who Jason really makes sure he sort of names every time, which I find particularly strange. But I understand why. It's because Ozzy challenged him, his use of academic materials, right, and plagiarism. But I found it interesting, that basically this was something where Rand Campbell was simply asking people to be compassionate and considerate and intolerant, of course. And then his final video, he talked a lot about intolerance and that he is intolerant, and he listed a bunch of things that he's intolerant of. And he said basically, if you're going to be tolerant, you have to be tolerant of intolerance. You have to be tolerant of everything. And of course, he went as far as to make an equivocation between homosexuality and people who defecate into one another's mouths as some sort of form of pleasure, turn on, whatever. That kind of leaves a person speechless. First of all, when it comes to tolerance, I don't know, I've never experienced this in my life until I came to experience fundamentalists, this extremism. You're either all the way one way or you're all the way the other way, and there's nothing in between. So if you're going to be a tolerant person, you have to be tolerant of everything. No, that's not the case. First of all, that particular nasty form of whatever that is, play, is not what we were discussing, or what you and JD were discussing in the video. This is this sort of slippery slope Bill O'Reilly argument, right? If we allow gays to marry, next thing you know, people are going to want to marry their goats and everything else, right? To me, this is where lifeboat scenarios go horribly wrong. When I've railed against lifeboat scenarios when we're talking about morality and philosophy in the past. And this is part of the reason why, because I think when you start treating those lifeboat scenarios as though they're on the same level as the day-to-day scenarios, the real stuff we deal with on the day-to-day basis and the questions that we really need answered on a day-to-day basis, you open up the door to the slippery slope argument from that point. It's just the worst equivocation I can think of. But all of that aside, I don't have to be tolerant of everything to be a tolerant person. And, I think personally my argument would be we can, in general, use philosophy to come to terms with what things we should be tolerant of and what things we should not be tolerant of. I think that's what a rational person does. But it got me thinking a lot about intolerance itself and who are truly the intolerant people on the planet, and why that, and what the potential damage is that can cause. As many of you know, I was raised sort of irreligious. I had a very, very basic, vague understanding that some people believed in this entity and that my parents were raised that way, but I was not exposed to it as a child very much at all. And it wasn't until my late teens when I started interacting with peers on that level where we might discuss those things that I really started to understand it, and of course my early adulthood. I grew up with the concept, the notion, and I think many people share this, that everyone is basically the same, that we're all fundamentally the same. Yeah, sure, we have different experiences and we have different beliefs, but the fundamental foundation of who we are is kind of the same from person to person. I think most atheists probably believe that, and in fact I think the majority of Christians actually believe that, not the fundamentalists, which I'll get to. And of course, if you look at a lot of our social sciences, they're all predicated on that, right? So psychology and the other sort of studies of, you can look at books on how to sell things to people, relationship advice, business advice. All of these things would be quite useless to put in a book form if we weren't foundationally very much the same, that we didn't, in general, with some variability, but in general respond very similarly to similar situations and stimuli and that sort of thing. And I think there's merit to that, and I think it's backed up philosophically, and scientifically. And again, I even think that most Christians, most average, everyday Christians, probably feel the same way. It's when you get to the fundamentalists, fundamentalist Christians, probably fundamentalist Muslims as well, although I've never been exposed to any, so I can't speak to that. But it's when you get there that they actually have a belief that there is a fundamental difference between what they might call the elect and the damned, between a believer and an unbeliever. They actually believe there is a fundamental, foundational difference between them and us. And I find this highly troubling, because I think it allows them to treat us differently. It kind of makes sense to me anyway, and I've witnessed it. There's a sense that they are, and they would argue this point, but I would urge you to think of this logically, they are, in every way, better than we are. Now they might say, oh no, I'm a sinner, I deserve, hellfire too. I'm just saved because of the grace of God. But that is the difference. And you would be hard-pressed to, I think, come up with an argument that says that they're not fundamentally better than we are in some form or fashion, because otherwise there would be no reason, no subjective or objective reason for God to have them be the elect and the damned be the damned, if there was not some fundamental difference between them. And I think we're fortunate in the West that we live in the times that we do, and not maybe the times of the Crusades or some other religious conquests, because it's when you can label another group as being fundamentally different than your group that you can legitimize treating them differently and doing different things to them. I'm reminded, of course, of the time of war, when there were posters of these sort of demonized caricatures of Japanese people with the very evil kind of slanted eyes and the evil buck-toothy kind of grins. This was, of course, meant to demonize the Japanese people to the Americans, so that they could get their consent, to enter into the war. And regardless of how you feel about war and conflict and those sorts of things, that's clearly bullshit. They're not fundamentally different than we are. The average Japanese citizen is no more evil and not foundationally different than the average American. But by creating this image of them demonized as someone that is somehow substantially different, then they were able to hopefully, in their to their goals, get acceptance for waging war against them. And so I do find this notion that there is a fundamental difference between us highly troubling. I noticed recently on the Atheist Chef, he had posted a video that was very good, talking about the 8-year-old who was very upset that his mom might be going to hell, and that discussion that went on. And I noticed an old friend, Econ Recon, I think is his username. He's someone I battled a little bit in text comments before I ever started producing videos. And he's a believer, but he's very vague about what his beliefs are. He'll sort of make the argument from ignorance. Look around you. If you think this is, just chance, without your time machine, there's no way, you must be a fool. You can't prove anything. But he's very, very aggressive about it. And he actually had spoken a time ago that I was listening to some of his videos about a reboot. He was talking about sort of a crash of civilization. And when this crash of civilization comes, he's going to be going and looking for the people he deems responsible for the reboot. This would be gays and lesbians and anyone who supports gay and lesbian rights, and he's going to deal with them, right? So he's, obviously threatening physical violence. This is sort of, I think, along the lines of the Rand Campbell rants, where he talks about coming and beating people up and giving them smacks and whatever. They're hiding behind the internet, of course. I think if there was ever a reboot, this guy would be too busy fighting for his own survival to be thinking he's going looking for anybody. But the point is, he has labeled a group that he deems fundamentally different, and he's given himself the all clear to go and inflict violence upon those people. And again, find this highly troubling. Of course, yes, and it should be noted too, it's going to be gay marriage that brings about the crash of civilization, right? Not the fight for global power, war, some sort of environmental disaster, or some economic crash. No, it's going to be that, right? Anyway, that's something that I find highly troubling. And of course, in some ways, it's more troubling that there's nothing that they have no validation of their belief system in the first place. No concrete one. Some of them will say, I've had some sort of a divine revelation, a visitation, but the majority of them, Cy Ten Bruggencate, for instance, disbelieves that anyone has had any kind of a divine revelation, extra-biblical, in modern times. He says that, scripturally that's not supported. So there's some disagreement there as well. And so someone like Cy Ten Bruggencate and many others, they may have either been brought up in the faith and they just believe. Some others may claim that they have been brought to belief by some sort of reasoned argument. But either way, they have no absolute, empirical, verifiable proof that what they're saying is even true, that they actually do happen to believe in the one true God, that there even is a God, and that they happen to believe in the one true God, and that they are actually saved. Which means to me then that when they make these distinctions between sort of them and us, that it is based in irrationality. Because no rational person would say, I believe in this division so strongly that I would be actually willing to do things. Fortunately, again, we live in modern times, so even the fundamentalists aren't quite as fundamental as they could be. There's some things that they could do to unbelievers that would be probably scripturally supported that they don't do, and they find, obviously ways around that, I think. The Westboro Baptist Church, even them, they're more fundamentalist than most, and there's some things they're willing to do, but they sort of stray away from violence. Whether that's just cowardice or whether they've found a way to rationalize that they're not commanded to stone unbelievers to death or whatever. But again, there's an irrationality to that if you can't even ultimately validate that this fundamental difference between you and another person even exists. To me, this is the hallmark of intolerance. And once again, it seems to be fundamentalism that rises to the surface as the real issue. As Ozzy always says, and I agree with him totally, religion is not the enemy. Irrationality is the enemy. Because I think if you're being rational and you're using solid reasoning, you're being very philosophical about things, I think you'll come to the right conclusion at some point. It's only when you've got confirmation bias and some sort of deep-seated desire possibly to believe certain things that you'll allow your reasoning to be clouded. It reminds me of the recent Eric Hovind video where there's those floods and he's walking around the streets saying, what do you think caused this? Millions of years and a little bit of water, or a lot of water in a short bit of time? And Wildwood Claire is finally back. Welcome back, Claire. Made a great video where she had a brief discussion about meandering water versus raging torrents in the channeled scablands of Washington State versus the Grand Canyon, and the difference of those water features. And if you look at the aerial view of both, it's pretty obvious that a huge, massive torrent of water would not carve out the Grand Canyon with the meandering flow that you can see that has actually eroded the canyon over time. And this is cognitive dissonance. This is someone who's choosing to believe something and will overlook evidence to the contrary as often and as much as it takes to maintain those beliefs. That is irrationality. And those people, unfortunately, have the ultimate belief that they are fundamentally, foundationally different than unbelievers. And to me, that's the true intolerance. And it's something that causes me concern. Again, we're very fortunate in modern times. We don't have to worry about that quite as much, at least not from the Christian fundamentalists. Muslim fundamentalists are a little bit of a different story. But even in the West, we're somewhat shielded from that. I would be very much interested to hear what everyone thinks on the subject. I think it's definitely time for me to go to bed. I've blabbed long enough. And so thanks very much for listening. Have a great night.